Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is Gary Arndt. With me again, as usual, is the man who got the key to the city of Appleton and immediately used it to brew beer, Bobby Fleshman.
Thanks, Gary.
And to this episode, we're going to be looking to the south, far, far south, to the city of Oshkosh. And we have the author of the Oshkosh Beer Blog with us, Lee Reiherzer.
There you go.
Nailed it.
And
don't worry, I'm not offended if anybody gets it wrong.
So for people, there are people who aren't from this area, so I want to explain. You probably have heard of Oshkosh more than you've heard of the city of Appleton, because there's Oshkosh Truck, there's Oshkosh Bagash, and there's the annual fly-in every year for 1 week a year. It's the world's busiest airport. It's a slightly smaller community than Appleton, but in the same area. Very common for people to drive back about 30-minute drive, maybe. It's not that far. But as someone who grew up in this area, there's certain things that I remember seeing kind of at every bar or tavern, and I never gave it a lot of thought. It was just stuff that you saw. And just perusing your blog, you've gone into a great amount of detail into what only seems like damn near every bar in the city of Oshkosh. And for people, again, outside of Wisconsin, we have a lot of bars.
I'm really into trying my readers' patience with this stuff.
Growing up, the only thing I really knew is I collected beer cans in like the 70s, like a lot of kids did. And I just remember having a can of Chief Oshkosh, and that was my knowledge of what was happening there.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us how you got started into this obsession?
Well, in 2010, I decided I was going to start this blog. And the original idea was in 2010, that's when Oshkosh craft beer kind of started kicking in. Like a lot of the local bars were putting on good beer and things like that. Fox River Brewing Company was going strong. So I thought I'd, just do this blog that basically would have tap lists for the places serving good beer. That quickly morphed into the history of it. I knew Oshkosh had I'm not originally from Oshkosh. I knew Oshkosh had a good brewing history. So I started digging into that and publishing those articles as well. And then, I just got bit with that history bug, and I haven't been able to shake it since. It's really turned into a history blog for the most part. I was writing quite a bit about craft beer as well up until about 4 years ago. But really, it's become more and more history of saloons and bars and prohibition and anything social culture around drinking in Oshkosh.
One of the things, and again, this is something I've kind of noticed, but I never really paid attention to, was the woodwork and a lot of the physical infrastructure in a lot of bars.
Yeah.
That some of these places had really beautiful woodwork. Where did a lot of this come from? Was it just all woodworkers, or was there a place that
Oshkosh was a big woodworking town, but there was one place in Oshkosh in particular called Robert Brand & Sons Company. And in the 1870s, they started furnishing interiors of bar rooms. And they grew more and more elaborate as they went along. So prior to Prohibition, you had some of these just beautiful bar rooms that were built in Oshkosh, and it was Robert Brand & Sons that outfit them. Brand & Sons got quite large. They hooked up with Schlitz as well. And at one point, almost 90% of their business was being sent out of Oshkosh to Schlitz-tied houses around the country. So their bars spread all over. But yeah, Brand was responsible for most of those really beautiful bars that were in Oshkosh. Most of them are gone. There's still a few places where they hang on. Bob's Trails Inn in Oshkosh has one. Oblio's on Main Street. They've got a beautiful Brand bar. That's a post-Prohibition Brand bar. But there's a number of places in that area, in the Oshkosh area, that still have these Brand & Son bars, and they're beautiful. Not all of them are kept up real well. A lot of times the tavern owner doesn't really realize what they have, so they're hanging all kinds of crap on the back bar. But yeah, most of those famous bars in Oshkosh were outfitted by Brand & Sons.
I don't even know if there's a name for it. Maybe but there was always like a Wisconsin tavern aesthetic that everyone you went into, it kind of had similarities. The beer signs on the wall, more often than not, my particular time, it would have been like an old style sign out front. Yeah. They had frozen pizzas or something, and it was just kind of all
Yeah, often on a corner.
very similar, yeah.
Often near a church. The thing is, the reason there is that aesthetic is because a lot of the places that are still around today have a pre-Prohibition history. So a lot of these places were built and established before Prohibition. You know, like in Oshkosh in particular, when Prohibition hit, there were 100 saloons in Oshkosh in 1919. In 1920, you look in the city directory, and there's 100 soft drink parlors. There had never been a soft drink parlor in Oshkosh prior to that. You know, they all turned into speakeasies, and they were all selling alcohol. So most of these places were able to make it through Prohibition one way or another. And then they continued on. So you see that common element because they're all coming out of the same base, you know, out of the same era, sort of.
We're sitting in the Prohibition room. How much was Prohibition really enforced in this area?
Well, it depends where you were. Appleton was enforced pretty heavily. You know, Appleton was always a much more, you know, it was a more virtuous sort of city. Oshkosh was considered Sin City. So in Oshkosh, the police basically refused to enforce it. The mayor of Oshkosh, when Prohibition arrived, said flat out, "We will not enforce Prohibition." You know, they were dead set against it. And, you know, the police came out of these same neighborhoods that had all these saloons. You know, there were a lot of South Side taverns, and they weren't going to go bust their friends. You know, they were all on the same level. So it was, in Oshkosh, it really wasn't enforced at all.
Is it true that if taxes were paid, that people turned the other way? They didn't.
Yeah,
Or,
There was, and where the trouble would start is that, particularly in Oshkosh, but also Menasha, this happened in Appleton too, but to a lesser extent. The federal prohibition agents, and a lot of them based out of Milwaukee, state prohibition agents as well, you know, had knew of what was going on up here, and they weren't going to permit it. So they would just make these periodic raids where they'd come blowing into town and try to bust all these people.
Ceremonial?
Yeah. Well, I mean...
Oh, they were impactful, intended to be.
They were impactful on the people who got caught. Yeah. It certainly didn't it certainly didn't dent the drinking culture at all.
Gotcha.
You know, these people were not going to stop drinking. I mean, they all come out of that... Oshkosh was a very heavily German immigrant city. They weren't going to give up their culture. They didn't even understand why this was happening. It was inconceivable to them. I've got records from breweries, you know, in just a few years before Prohibition. They're completely oblivious that this is coming down. Everyone else knew it. You know, they had heard of it. They just refused to believe it. So when you've got that kind of culture, they're going to resist it at every turn. And in Oshkosh, they absolutely did.
How much of your research has gone into the Wisconsin Institution of Supper Clubs?
I haven't researched that, but a good friend of mine, Ron Fiola, has.
We should do a whole show on supper clubs if we can overlap with beer somehow.
Get Ron Fiola. You can find easy to find. But yeah, he'd be perfect for it.
I want to go back to what I mentioned about Chief Oshkosh.
Okay.
How many different beers were brewed in Oshkosh? Was Chief Oshkosh like the biggest one? Because I've always said like each community kind of had a brewery.
Yeah, but
we had Adler Brau here.
Sure.
Was that the Oshkosh beer?
Well, the thing is, like, so since 1849, Oshkosh has had 21 breweries. You know, so there were a lot of breweries. The biggest of them all was the Oshkosh Brewing Company. You know, by 1856, 57, they were doing 60,000 barrels of beer a year. These are big breweries, you know. I mean, actually, Adler Brau by the late 40s was up to over 50,000 barrels a year as well. You know, so these are substantial breweries. Chief Oshkosh is the best-selling beer that was ever produced in Oshkosh. And also, they have the widest distribution. So you still see that memorabilia all over the state. And it's highly collectible now, so it kind of gets more prominence maybe than it should sometimes.
Before you go on from the George Walter, Adler Brau, is it true that there was a bubbler? You guys call them. I'm from Oklahoma. I'm catching up with this.
Bubblers, right?
Yeah. Is it true that there was a bubbler that beer poured from or came out of?
I'm not aware of that. I don't know.
Okay, there's a rumor anyway, or some kind of a self-serve.
So in a lot of these breweries, and I would bet they had it there.
Yeah.
You know, if you were familiar with the people at the brewery or you were a vendor or whatever, you could go in the back room and you could. There's Zwickel, you know, you could tap right off that tank and take beer. This is well known at like People's Brewing Company in Oshkosh, which was a heavily German brewery.
Right.
And the Germans living in that neighborhood and stuff, they'd all go in there and drink off the tank, you know, up to a certain point.
Right.
And that was happening even in the 1950s yet. So
that's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the connection that people had to these breweries is it's hard to believe now because now people like your place. People get connected to this, and it's become part of their their culture as well. But what was different then is that these breweries were much more isolated. You're in this environment now where you've got multinational corporations pouring in tons of pale lager, and people within the community have a different idea of what beer is. At that point, you look at pre-Prohibition and immediately after, beer for them was that local brewery. That was beer. There was they didn't look beyond that. So
A bit like villages in Germany, you have Dortmunder, Alt Beer, Kolsch.
it's very much like
every community has its own style. Yeah.
The thing is, like, by and large, the people through this area, there's exceptions, but by and large, they were German brewers. So they came with that lager idea in mind. I don't know how. Stop me when I go too far afield here, but
Allison's not here to stop you, so we're going to go down the deepest rabbit hole now.
So what's interesting is a lot of those German brewers that came over, lager was the new thing to them as well. In Bavaria and in that part of Bohemia or Czech Republic, that butts up against Bavaria, lager had been there for a couple centuries, but it didn't really move out of that southern part of Germany and Czech Republic until about 1820 forward. So when you've got brewers from the north coming to Oshkosh, they're just in that first wave of lager being the thing, and they're bringing that over here. So in some cases, the tradition isn't especially deep. It's just like a craft brewer now almost making IPA. It's the thing.
And they're doing it with local ingredients at this point. So this gets into the 6-row conversation, or no?
Entirely.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll see ads for all these breweries around here where in the newspapers, they're calling out to farmers, give us your barley, bring us your barley. We'll pay top dollar for it. They're using 6-row Wisconsin grown barley, usually in the fields of that same county. Totally a local product. In a lot of cases, from the hop growing takes off in this area, especially down in the western side of Winnebago County, on the northwestern side, I should say. Hop growing takes off in the late 1840s. And from the 1840s, into like 1870, they're growing local hops. So you've got this beer. This is before, corn really doesn't come into the picture for these lagers until about 1875 or so. But you've got this beer that's made of locally grown malted barley. In most cases, the brewers are malting it themselves. These breweries all have their own malt houses. They're using locally grown hops. The yeast they're sharing it amongst each other. They're brewing lagers typically.
Right.
But this is truly a local product,
I know that Stone Arch has tried to bring back the Adlerbrow recipe. I don't know how accurate it is. I've tried it. I'll be honest, I wasn't a fan of it. Has anyone tried to do that with any of the classic Oshkosh beers that you know?
Well, as a matter of fact, Gary, I wrote a magazine-sized booklet last year.
So where Jody comes into the picture?
Yeah. Well, so it was for the Society of Oshkosh Brewers, and I'm a club member of the SOBs. So and that was that's a recipe book of all its homebrew equivalents of Oshkosh recipes from the 1840s. From 1849, I should say, up until today with the current breweries. But I've been working with Jody Cleveland at Bare Bones Brewery, and we've been doing something called a Heritage Series, where these recipes that I've collected, Jody's been brewing them there, and they've been super interesting.
Is it just, are they actually like canning or bottling it, or is it just available?
Yeah, so they've canned it. Like the last one, we did a Bach beer that came out of the Oshkosh Brewing Company in 1895, and that got canned and sold on tap at a few places around Oshkosh. Yeah.
Of all the bars in Oshkosh, and there are a lot, and there were a lot historically, what were the ones that kind of stand out to you, either because of the architecture or because there was a character that ran it, or for whatever reason?
Well, I mean, there's so many.
Or they had murders or something.
Well, you say murders. Okay, so Oblio's is one of the places that really has just an incredible history. Yeah. So that building was built in 1884, and the year later it got purchased by August Eline of Schlitz. He immediately turned it into a Schlitz tied house. So from there up until Prohibition, You go in there, there's nothing you're going to get but Schlitz beer. Now, the reason this is important is because in Oshkosh, they were really resistant to outside breweries for the longest time. And Schlitz, through Oblio's, was the first one to kind of try to...
Even though it's Milwaukee.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that didn't mean anything. As far as people in Oshkosh were concerned, and maybe this is still the case to a certain degree, Oshkosh is another country, or Milwaukee's another country, you know. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there was this super strong attachment to local beer. And that continued to be so all the way up until about 1955, 1956. In the 60s, it starts breaking apart, you know. But as far as like bars in Oshkosh, there were a lot of bars that were actually owned by the Oshkosh Brewing Company. Another brewing company in Oshkosh that owned a lot of bars was Rar Brewing Company. The oldest tavern in Oshkosh is probably Jerry's on Seepy. It's a neighborhood place, you know. It really still very popular. That place was tied to Rar Brewing Company for years and years until Rar, well, after Prohibition, that arrangement was made illegal, but Rar always had a hand in it until Rar closed in 1956. But that's another place where, you know, you go in there and it's the old bar back there. It just has that kind of feel to it, you know. A bar that recently closed that hopefully will be reopening soon is going to be Whiskey's. That was another Oshkosh Brewing Company tied house, had a brand, Robert Brand and Sons back bar in it, just a classic tied house, you know. So just to be clear with tied houses, if you go into these places, the only beer you're going to get, the only beer that's available is the beer from the brewery that saloon is tied to.
So that was popular in England. Was it also popular in Germany? These ideas of tied houses?
Yeah. And it didn't start off that way in America. That really kind of, there were tied houses, no doubt, from 1850s on. But in the 1880s, as travel became easier and it became easier to ship beer by rail and stuff, these local breweries now had to really start finding ways to defend themselves, you know, because they were going to, now they've got competition from outside big breweries that produce on an economy of scale they can't match. So to protect themselves, they started buying up saloons. This is what I had mentioned before, the Rar Brewing Company. This is what they did. So at one point, they had over 20 saloons in Oshkosh, just one small brewery, you know, and that was it. You couldn't compete with Rar. And all through Prohibition, this brewery that was doing, you know, about 15 to 20,000 barrels a year, which is a lot, you know, by our standards. But back in the day, that's fairly normal to small, and that's how they could just keep the competition at bay. Nobody else could sell beer in their tied houses, but Rar beer.
How much of the sales were on site versus some you could walk away with?
Before Prohibition, if you were drinking beer, chances are you're drinking it at a saloon. You know, that's where most of the beer was sold. Now, you know, especially prior to the 1900s, the laws pertaining to bottling were onerous, you know, and most breweries just didn't want to go down this road. You had to have the bottling done in a separate building. You couldn't do it in the brewery. So prior to that, a lot of these breweries never wanted to get into bottling. In Oshkosh, you had 15 independent bottlers, just guys that set up bottle shops so they'd go buy beer at the local breweries and then bottle it for sale. But the breweries didn't want to deal with it, you know. So most of their beer was all coming out of saloons. You know, it wasn't until after Prohibition that really you see this changeover where the packaged product becomes more prominent than the saloon product, and for some, or the tavern product at that point.
For timeline's sake, so Prohibition ends in 1933.
Yeah, it starts in 1920, ends in 1933.
Yeah. So how quickly did it recover? It sounds like Oshkosh ignored it altogether, so maybe it was 1933.
Well, the thing is, the breweries couldn't ignore it. You know, so they couldn't. The city itself.
Yeah.
I'll get back to that in just a minute because it's kind of interesting what happened there. But the city, the breweries ignored it, or the city ignored it. The breweries couldn't.
Right.
So after Prohibition, that's when, you know, they all came back right away, and the sales were good. The problem that kind of happened is that period leads right into World War II and rationing, and I mean, they couldn't get the ingredients they needed. They were using all sorts of substitutes for malt. So it was a real struggle. By the end of the 1940s, it was booming. These breweries were going great. Now, to the thing about Prohibition, you know, so when Prohibition started in 1920, there were 3 breweries in Oshkosh: Rar Brewing Company, Peoples, and the Oshkosh Brewing Company. This is one of the great ironies, I think. During that period, that 13-year period, there were no fewer than 12 wildcat breweries in Oshkosh. So as soon as these breweries can no longer make beer, all these independent, these illegal wildcat breweries start springing up there in warehouses, in the basements of saloons.
I was going to bring that up.
Yeah.
I've heard about these basement breweries.
Oh yeah, they were all over. I mean,
a glorified home brewer, or
yeah, but I mean, so the only way you ever know about these places is when they get busted. That's it.
And distilling was happening as well.
Oh, distilling was off the charts.
Yeah.
There was moonshine production in Oshkosh like crazy. But with the breweries, when they get busted, you see these places get busted. Typically, there's a report that comes out saying how much beer they had on hand or how much they had in fermentation. And if you scale that out and you take into account the summer months are kind of higher than the rest of the year, the colder months, some of these breweries in basements are doing about 4,000 barrels a year. It's an incredible amount of beer.
For context, that's about triple what we do.
It's nuts.
Here. Yeah.
It's crazy,
So you should support Prohibition. Like the drug lords,
if you want to go
Al Capone, yeah.
Yeah. But, and the thing is, the breweries kind of had a little bit of a hand in it, too. The Oshkosh Brewing Company, home brewing just went nuts. The Oshkosh Brewing Company was selling wort to home brewers, and they were selling hops and all this stuff.
And with the instructions of how not to make beer?
The Oshkosh Brewing Company cans of wort are hilarious.
Yeah.
So they've always got some woman dressed in like she's, got an apron on. She's holding the bag of biscuits or something. She's going to use this to cook food and then, make bakery or something with it. And then on the bottom, there's always a note. Hop flavored. So, unless you want your brownies with that bitter finish, that's good for nothing.
Winemakers in California did that. They sold bricks of grapes with instructions of what not to do because it would be illegal.
Yep.
Do not, put this in a dark place. Do not let this ferment.
It was all out in the open.
Yeah, everyone knew. I mean, and in Oshkosh, in 1921, the first homebrew shop opens. There's 3 more that start. Every grocery, you look at ads from the 1920s, grocery stores in Oshkosh, they all have, malt syrup for sale. They're all doing it,
So breweries are making the malt extract.
Yeah. The malt, like Oshkosh Brewing Company did. So a lot of these wildcat breweries, they weren't just buying, 3-pound cans of malt extract. Yeah. The brewery in New London and the brewery in Ripon both got into selling wort. So they were producing wort, and these wildcat brewers would go up there and they'd bring it home in barrels, and then they didn't have to mash and do all this stuff,
Wow.
They'd then just bring that to their basement, to their fermenting tubs, pitch their cake of yeast in and go, so.
One of the things we've talked about on this podcast quite a bit is this transition that happened where early 20th century up until 60s, 70s, a lot of communities, at least in Wisconsin, had local breweries. And then they all kind of died kind of around the same time period, early 70s, late 60s. And then you saw this consolidation in the beer industry to a point where there are only a couple major national brewers. And then you kind of are now seeing the pendulum swing back. What happened in Oshkosh during this period? When did the breweries kind of go under, and then how did it affect the bar scene there?
So when things started turning bad in Oshkosh was the first bad sign was 1961 when the Oshkosh Brewing Company was sold to David Eline, who was an heir to the Schlitz family or the Schlitz Brewery. This is a story that is something else, but he basically ran that brewery down the tubes. He had this idea that he was going to make that brewery into a distribution brewery, took the focus off the local market, and as soon as that happened, people revolted. They didn't like the idea, first of all, that Eline was coming up there to take over the brewery. That was the first mistake, or that was the first problem. And then right away, he comes in and he changes the recipe, changes the label, the whole thing, and it just went downhill from there. So that's really when things start falling apart. The story in Wisconsin of how these breweries all sort of collapse at the same time, or the same period at least, is kind of complicated. Because what happened is, coming out of Prohibition, all these smaller breweries around the state, they've got trucks now and it's so much easier to start distributing to other markets. So these small breweries are all competing against each other strictly on price. Now, if you look at like the price of, let's say a case of Adler Brau in 1950 would probably be about $2.40. A case of Pabst would be about $3.30. So those macro beers were more expensive than the local beers. So once these local breweries, these smaller breweries are all starting to go into each other's markets and compete against each other, it's just forcing the price down. And the coup de grace kind of is when in the 1950s, late 50s or so, all through the 50s really, but really intensifies in the late 50s, early 60s, is when the national brands start advertising heavily and they start questioning the quality of local beer, and then they start also cutting their prices to compete against that. So it's this just series of instances that come together to create a market that is untenable for these small breweries. A brewery like George Walter Adler Brau here, they're selling a beer for $1 a case cheaper, and it's costing them twice as much to make it as what it's costing Pabst to make, and people get this.
And the reason is they're not spending all that money on marketing.
Right.
That's the difference there.
Yeah. And people get the perception that these are just cheap, no good beers. When in fact, I've seen a lot of recipes from these breweries. They're no different than what's being done at the big breweries. And in some cases, actually in quite a few cases, they're cutting fewer corners than some of the big breweries are at that time. So a lot of this has to do with perception of what quality beer is, and then these market influences that all come together to create the problem.
The only brewery I can think of in Wisconsin that was kind of a local brewery that survived is Point. Are there any others that you know of?
Leinenkugel did the same thing.
That's
so
true.
that's two examples where, and Huber as well, which is now Minhas.
Yeah.
All three of those breweries, if you look at them, they're in markets that are basically the same size. They're all a little bit isolated, and they never take their focus off that local market. They just keep pounding, this is your hometown beer. And that's how they get through. Chippewa Falls, Leinenkugel, we know what happened there, and, they eventually sold out to Miller, and Miller just did them in. So,
not to derail the conversation, but what's the latest news on that situation?
Well, I don't know if you heard, the family's trying to get it so far. Molson Coors, as they are, has no interest in selling that brand.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah, it's a shame because any connection to that these macro brands anymore, it's strictly just a aspect of marketing. There's nothing real there at these. Pabst hasn't had a brewery until recently. I guess they just bought one in California. Hasn't had a brewery in 20 years. It's just a brand that's floating out there.
Right.
When the local breweries kind of went on decline in the 70s, you saw this nationalization, but then around, I don't know, you'd say 90s maybe, is when it started to come back. You saw more craft beers. How did that take place, and what are some of the major local brewers now in Oshkosh?
Yeah, well, so craft beer really, was kicked off in the very late 70s, early 80s. In Milwaukee, I was living in Milwaukee at that time. 85, I was drinking Sprecher beer. Sprecher had started. Lakefront started a couple years later. So it really...
a couple of waves here, though, right?
Yeah, definitely. And then you've got, in Oshkosh, really, the brewing thing really comes out of the homebrew club. If you look at the breweries now, each of them has some connection, direct connection to that homebrew club that started in Oshkosh in 91. Also in 91, in Oshkosh, the Midcoast Brewing Company, which brewed Chief Oshkosh Red Lager, that was a contract brewery. They did it at Point. That started. Fox River Brewing Company in Oshkosh started in 95. Up here in Appleton, the Appleton Brewing Company, Adler, or Dos Banditos, people know it as by, that started in 89, one of their earliest brew pubs. So that's when things start coming back. You've got that down period from like 95 to 2000, which I think is kind of an interesting situation. What always precedes these falling off in brewery seems to be fruit. In 96, you got all these breweries that are making, blueberry wheats and apricot and all this other stuff. And, the market dives. That's
Is it maybe because, not to get on that tangent, but is it maybe because we're steering the public away from the flavors that made beer? Or who knows, right?
I would like to think that. I don't know. But I mean, every time, that beer tries to become something other than what it really is, it kind of fails.
Right. Seltzer can win that battle, or
any mixed drink is going to always win that battle. But so then up until from that period, that was kind of like a real cooling off period, and then you see things start kicking in again after about 2005, where things start picking up. In Oshkosh, Fox River Brewing Company started in '95. They survived that slump. Bare Bones didn't start until 2015, and then Fifth Ward in 2017. There was a small brewery in Oshkosh, High Holder Brewing Company, started in 2018. They had some issues there. They didn't survive COVID. But yeah, that's when that really starts picking up again in the 2000s.
Mm-hmm. We get people that visit McFleshman's from really far away. Like we've had people take multi-hour trips out of their way on trip, or they've come from a distance. So if somebody is coming from, let's say, I-41, they're coming north, you're going to have to go right through Oshkosh without playing favorites. What would be some of the stops you would recommend if they want to go visit some of the better craft beer places in Oshkosh?
Well, I mean, so you mean aside from breweries or?
Yeah, no breweries specifically.
Yeah, so I mean, Bare Bones is right off there, and obviously I've got a little bit of a connection there with those heritage beers. So I always think, if somebody can kind of get one of those beers and think, wow, what's going on here? There's this history of brewing here, and it's actually being, furthered by this craft brewery.
And Jody's beer nerdism is documented on our own podcast. So
cool.
There's some groundwork there.
But Fox River Brewing Company is like your just classic Wisconsin brew pub. It's one of the early brew pubs, and it still has that definite brew pub kind of vibe to it. It's fun. Fifth Ward is, they've gone down a route where they're doing. They both came out of working in restaurants, and they came at it with a real culinary sort of approach to beer. So from the jump, they've been so I know those guys as home brewers. We were in the SOBs together, and right away in the club, they were making these beers that they were infusing with all kinds of, kitchen sort of stuff. And they've continued down that path. They do all sorts of stuff, though. I mean, it's not it's not fair to pigeonhole any of them on what they do, but yeah. And, if you're like, Bare Bones has a beer out called Oshkosh Lager, which I worked with Jody on the recipe for that. And it's really just a mashup of People's Brewing Company's People's Beer and Chief Oshkosh Beer married together in one beer. And I think he's done a really good job at kind of getting there on that beer.
If somebody wanted to visit, not this isn't based on their beer they serve, but on the ambiance, a classic neighborhood tavern with the Wisconsin aesthetic, where would you recommend they go?
So I wouldn't say Oblio's.
You wouldn't.
Oblio's is a downtown bar.
Okay,
and the downtown bars in Oshkosh are always different than the neighborhood bars. So in the 1870s, or actually more like 1880s, Oshkosh just has this explosion of neighborhood bars. Every corner gets a bar, and some of these places are still around. One of them is, I mentioned before, Jerry's. This is, probably the oldest. I need to dig a little more on this, but probably the oldest tavern in Oshkosh. That's a classic. There's another one on Merritt Street in Oshkosh called Bob's Trail's End. And this is a place I love taking people to, because when you go in there, it's like, what the hell is this? Because it's got the old brand bar behind it. He's not especially concerned with making sure it's pristine. It's a lived-in bar. It's a day in, and they sell these hot dogs. So the whole place smells like hot dogs. But it's the friendliest place. It's the most fun. It's one of these places that it's utterly unique.
So this is an OG dive bar. The way you describe that.
Exactly.
I love that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That place, okay, listen, just stop me. But that place, so I did a deep dive on that bar because I knew there was good history there. That place in 1890 had a rat pit in it. So they would bring in, rat terriers, and they'd throw the rats in the pit.
Oh, so this is not a metaphor. It is a rat pit. This is a literal pit of rats.
This is not a metaphor, and this is not the only rat pit Oshkosh had. Yeah. But yeah, Bob's Trail's End, back in the day, they had a rat pit. And all through Prohibition, it was a speakeasy. Never shut down.
Before we conclude, is there more to say about People's Brewing and how it connects with Black ownership?
Yeah, I mean, this is getting hard for me to talk about because people will accuse me of things that are absolutely not true. So the story is that this is what happened. In 1970, a group of Black entrepreneurs from Milwaukee were trying to buy a brewery. They tried buying Blatz. They couldn't get the money to buy Blatz. People's Brewing Company, they came up and they ended up being able to buy that. Now, they were given a loan by the Small Business Association that was kind of supporting Black entrepreneurship. They got the brewery in 1970. The night that they closed on the sale, the Milwaukee Sentinel publishes an article saying that these guys are going to come to Oshkosh, they're going to fire all the white workers and replace them with Black workers from Milwaukee. You know how that's going to go over. So all these bars in Oshkosh take People's Beer off tap. Now, Theodore Mack, who's the head of this group, moves to Oshkosh, goes around town saying that story is wrong. There's no truth to this whatsoever. Comes back and starts running People's. After that initial, rough water there, he does very well. All of a sudden, he's selling more beer in the area than they had before. The thing is, he didn't want a regional brewery. His idea was that he was going to take People's and make it a national brewery, selling it as a brand that run by these Black entrepreneurs and try to sell it in urban markets saying, this is our story. The problem was he took on so much debt and that he couldn't afford the advertising that he needed to do in these markets to introduce himself. So within 2 years, the brewery failed. Now, since that time, there's been all this stuff about People's failed because of racism. And listen, I'm sure he encountered all kinds of things, but that's not why the brewery failed. They ran out of money. At the time of their failure, they were selling more beer than they had before. Just the debt load that he took on and his ambitious plan, he couldn't finance it. So that's what
I never knew that story.
Yeah. It is. It's the first Black-owned brewery in Wisconsin.
Yep.
For a long time, it was thought to be the first Black-owned brewery in America, but there was one been discovered in Pennsylvania that beat them out by a few months. So,
all right, well, that'll conclude this episode of Respecting the Beer. The producer of Respecting the Beer, it's David Kelso. Without David, there would be no show. Make sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player so you never miss an episode. And join the Facebook group to get updates between the episodes and support the show over on Patreon. Patrons to the show are going to get access to special beer. Make a note. Links to both of those things can be found in the show notes. And until next time, please remember to respect the beer.